The question I want to explore in this video is, could the United States have lost the Second World War once the country as a whole entered the war officially in December of 1941? The answer is no. Alright, thanks for watching, everyone. I'm thinking of sticking with a bi-weekly upload schedule for the future, and I'm also contemplating starting a Patreon. So if you could please like and subscribe, I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much. Okay, I guess there is a little bit more to say than that on the topic. And while it is really difficult and nearly impossible to imagine a realistic scenario in which the Western Allies more broadly lose the war once the United States gets involved, and by that I don't mean once we declare war, I mean once FDR started the Lend-Lease program. By taking a look at this type of counterfactual history, we can ask the question of what people tend to misvalue when they're taking a look at military history. And also, at the end, I'll present a scenario that's sort of reasonably plausible in which at least the war could have gone a lot worse for the Western Allies than it actually did. And while I am going to take a look at some of those more familiar narratives with a bit of a different twist from what you've seen in the past, there are also some other really important factors that I think tend to go ignored even in these videos that otherwise do very good work in taking a look at this topic. So diving right in, one of the most prevalent narratives about Nazi Germany is that they lost the war because they didn't have enough fuel. And if they just could have gotten more fuel, they could have kept their military running. And I think this is a lot like saying that a football team that was defeated 48-10 lost because they failed to establish the running game. Technically, that may be true in that situation, but it also ignores a lot of other structural problems and deficits that Germany was facing that contributed to their loss. And so while a lot of people who put a lot of emphasis on Germany's lack of fuel aren't really saying this, let's imagine that Germany does make it that 500 miles past Stalingrad to the oil fields of the Soviet Union. What good would that have been? I mean, you can look around and see that the Germans had all the fuel that they needed for most of their major offensive operations during the war, right up until 1944, when it wouldn't have mattered anyway. And even if the Germans had suddenly been flushed with oil for some odd reason or another, it still would have required additional production capacity. It still would have required more trucks. It still would have required more ships to move everything. And bringing up that needed extra industrial capacity gets me to the real point here, which is that compared to the enemy that they chose to fight, which is to say almost the entire rest of the world, Germany had massive deficits in working factories, in resources, and manpower across the board. Just to demonstrate this point, the city of Pittsburgh and the area in its immediate vicinity.
We're from the town with the great football team. We cheer the Pittsburgh Steelers. Winning's a habit, not only a dream. Go out and get them Steelers.
Produced more steel, more electronics, and more high-capacity electrical generators than the entirety of the Axis powers combined during the war. And that's just one metropolitan area in the United States. That's not even factoring in all of the other ones. I think another important thing to mention that also puts this whole issue into perspective, this requires a little bit of explanation. So oftentimes in media involving World War II, we're kind of given the impression that almost every able-bodied man from 35 years on down to 18 was enlisted in part of the war effort. This actually isn't true. Mostly for guys who were over the age of about 28 or so, unless they explicitly volunteered for military service, these guys weren't drafted. A lot of them were intentionally left in their places in order to help out with the war industries. When the United States had originally drafted their plans for mobilization at the start of the war, they'd planned for 219 divisions in total. But after some initial conversations and more effort was put into planning war production, what the chiefs of staff and President Roosevelt realized was that they could get much more effective divisions by putting fewer men in the field and leaving more people behind for war production, granting every single one of their divisions superior firepower through the United States' superior production, and making every single individual division much more effective than their German counterparts. And so eventually, this 219 division plan was whittled down to just 90 divisions, which means that as far as the major combatants go, the United States had a much smaller portion of its manpower pool in the field doing the actual fighting of any of the Allied countries. So put a pin in that one, because I am going to come back to it later, but it's another important perspective to add. The United States not only was not nearly as taxed for resources as Nazi Germany and Vichy France and Italy and their other allies were, but they were able to explicitly hold back a portion of their manpower in order to massively boost their production, in order to put a more effective fighting force into the field. And so that brings up another conversational talking point, which is mentality. What was the mentality of the United States, both the military and the political leadership, going into the war? Narratives that have the Germans winning the war or somehow coming to a negotiated peace with the Western Allies after Normandy often rely on Germans performing battlefield feats that they really weren't capable of, or exploiting ridiculous mistakes by the Allies. But there simply weren't many opportunities for them to do this, and that was by design. Eisenhower was fully aware of his own army's potential liabilities, and so he sought a strategy of controlled and uniform advance over a broad front, which would deny the Germans opportunities to counterattack Allied forces when the Allies advanced. Prior to the advent of Blitzkrieg, the German army's preferred tactical doctrine was based on a controlled withdrawal and a counterattack of the advancing enemy. This exploited the enemy's disorganization and lack of a prepared position. This was true from the time of Frederick the Great through to the First World War, and was again adopted by the Nazis after 1942. The fact a lot of armchair generals who came along after the fact, especially those among the ranks of British historians, sharply criticized Eisenhower for not being more reckless after the Allies broke through in France in the late summer of 1944. In the belief of these historians, Eisenhower should have known that he was facing next to no German opposition in France after the breakout, and so driven straight to the Rhine River, or even along to Berlin. And something of this notion even made it into the film Patton, which a number of you, I'm sure, have seen. In that film, it's hinted that Eisenhower had deliberately siphoned off supplies away from his own men in order to slow the U.S. advance. In reality, the Allied armies in the breakout had overrun the Allied Expeditionary Force's logistical capacity, and so Eisenhower decided to halt their advance and wait for more reinforcements to come over and more supplies to come over from all the way across the Atlantic, which was a very important consideration. Any opportunity they had to replenish the forces had to come from thousands of miles away. And so Eisenhower waited for this. He wanted to establish supply ports rather than throwing his men piecemeal into the German heartland against prepared positions. Anyone thinking clearly about the big picture would say that Eisenhower had the right idea here. After all, especially when you have an army, as I'd mentioned before, that relies on its superior firepower, having all of the best equipment, you actually need munitions and supplies to be able to do something with that equipment. And so creating more opportunities for the Allied forces to outrun their logistical capacity or even be cut off just wouldn't have been wise. Now, that's not to say that there were no mistakes. Two of the most notable catastrophes for the Allied Expeditionary Force were Operation Market Garden and the Battle of the Hüttigen Forest. Market Garden is the only notable example of a time that Eisenhower allowed one of the generals under his command, in this case British General Montgomery, to abandon the broad front strategy. And it was a spectacular failure, complete with all the operational problems that come with an ill-conceived rapid advance. Despite being the worst disaster of the Western European theater, it didn't come close to breaking the Allied army. And then Hüttigen Forest was the worst battle in U.S. history that you've probably never heard of. And that's a shame, not just because of the memory of those who fought and died there, but also because it was an absolute meat grinder that was made worse by the fact that the Allies didn't really understand the objective of the battle until weeks into the battle, and so did not understand the Wehrmacht's resolve to fight there, nor did it understand the tactical positions of the German army. And so, since this video is not about that one battle, I won't go into it anymore, but it's really fascinating. You should look it up. And then the Hüttigen Forest also indirectly allowed the Germans greater success in their initial breakthrough in the Battle of the Bulge, because the units that were worn down in the first battle were then inadvertently placed directly into the main line of the Wehrmacht's advance during the Battle of the Bulge. And of course, that gets us to our next often pitched scenario for a negotiated peace, which is a German victory at the Battle of the Bulge, which is often brought up because it was the last major German offensive of the war, but this mythology has built up around it that, like, man, the Germans were so close to achieving their objective of capturing Antwerp and cutting the Allies in two. But they really were not. Just look at this map here. Let's move on. The idea that Eisenhower missed several opportunities to end the war earlier gained some steam in the academic community immediately following the end of the war. Chester Wilmot, he was an Australian journalist and most likely a personal friend of Monty, wrote a book called The Struggle for Europe, and the book laid out the case that Eisenhower's excessive caution added several months to the war and prevented the Allies from capturing Berlin. The narrative in the book caught fire in British academic circles and also in far-right circles across the world. The pride of Montgomery and the British military was hurt by the fact that the British made no real significant military contributions in the war following D-Day. It's not to say that there weren't people who fought and died, but there wasn't much significant strategic contribution that was made by the British following D-Day, and the only operation that Monty had led using his own preferred narrow front strategy had ended in total disaster, as I've mentioned before, Operation Market Garden. The far right wanted to find someone to blame for why it was, in their eyes, we had handed half of Europe to the Soviets, and so saying that Eisenhower, and by extension FDR and his staff, were at best incompetent and at worst had been traitors, suited their narrative. But guys, no one handed Eastern Europe to the Soviets. To address another obvious elephant in the room when you're constructing these scenarios, 2 weeks after D-Day, Zhukov and the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, which ended in the annihilation of an entire German army group. That's 4 German armies, or about 450,000 total combat casualties. In terms of total ratio of opposing forces, the highest ratio that the Western Allies ever faced was about 40% of the total Axis armies. And that was immediately after Operation Bagration, when, as I said, an entire German army group had been annihilated. The Soviets were usually facing about 70 to 80% of the entire combined Axis army. And as long as those early Lend-Lease supplies came in, there's no plausible scenario in which the Soviet Union does not destroy Nazi Germany and end up with at least half of Europe. The initial narrow front strategy and the narrative built upon it also depends on the idea that taking Berlin would have ended the war, which is then supposedly backed further by the fact that the war did end not long after Berlin fell in real life. But this idea is based on a pretty shallow analysis. The reason that the war ended not long after Berlin fell was because of the broad front strategy. With enemies closing in on both sides, the Nazis really didn't have an easily defensible position that they could retreat to. And so Hitler decided to stack the remaining forces in Berlin for a last stand. And even with the city entirely surrounded by 2.3 million Soviet and Polish soldiers, Berlin still fell after 16 days of some of the most ferocious house-to-house fighting of the war. So the best case scenario, best case in quotation marks, where the Western Allies drive to Berlin would still result in crippling losses of life for no obvious gain. And then you throw on top of that, after the war, you had all these memoirs that were coming out from people like Montgomery. Patton had obviously died not too long after the war, but a lot of U.S. generals were coming out with these sort of if I had done it style memoirs that tried to make the case that if Eisenhower had followed their suggestion on this, that, or the other thing, that the war would have gone down differently. And you even get a lot of these memoirs from German commanders who, along with trying to shed guilt for what had happened during the Holocaust, tried to make the war seem like it was a lot closer than it actually was. And the public took a lot of these memoirs at face value instead of examining them critically. And so while you want to blame movies like Patton for keeping this gods and generals mentality alive in the popular imagination for World War II, even though the realities of modern warfare for the last 3 or 4 decades counteract a lot of these, as I said, gods and generals type of narratives, there were a number of people who had actually been involved with the war who were vocally trying to make the case for why they would have done things differently or why Eisenhower screwed up here or there. And it's difficult to trace because if you go back through the records, they're largely non-existent. Eisenhower was very sure not to keep records of a lot of meetings and planning sessions in case they fell into the wrong hands. But for the most part, a critical analysis of U.S. combat doctrines during the Second World War, what type of military the United States Army was during World War II. The United States Army was the only fully motorized and mechanized army during the war. And of course, to maintain that and to maintain superior firepower and all of the notions that United States combat doctrines were built around, again, in order to minimize casualties, you would have needed a very healthy logistical supply that would have been threatened by any of these narrow front strategies. FDR picked Eisenhower explicitly because he knew that Ike wasn't a glory chaser and because he had demonstrated a firm understanding of supply and logistics in the pre-war army, and he understood the material needs of carrying out a war, and he had really, really good interpersonal political skills, and he understood the people around him, and he understood his subordinate officers. It was also very clear, based off of all this, that Ike would never throw away the lives of soldiers under his command unnecessarily. Eisenhower was always going to ensure that U.S. advances enjoyed overwhelming numbers, overwhelming firepower, and he used deception where and whenever was possible. For the Western Allies to have failed despite their overwhelming advantages in manpower and material, you would have needed 10 Hüttingen forests and market gardens. And in order to get that, you would have needed not only a different commander, but a different type of commander. And to get that, you would have needed different political leadership in the United States. And so when you look at all of this, this is why the sort of Philip K. Dick scenario for Man in the High Castle, where Roosevelt isn't president for a long enough period of time, or in that case doesn't even become president at all because he is assassinated by Giuseppe Zangara. That type of scenario really is the only realistic scenario for a United States military defeat against the German forces. You really would have needed the United States not to have had its poop in a group by the time the war started, not have been able to gear up production the way it did, not have had the prerequisite political leadership in place to make sure that we had commanders who understood the big picture the way that Eisenhower did. You would have needed all of that in order for there to be any realistic chance of the Western Allies either losing to the Germans or fighting to a stalemate. And so that gets us to the last aspect that I wanted to talk about of evaluating modern warfare and World War II and the Allied performance in World War II, and that is public support for the war. Oftentimes, people are led to believe that support for the war in the United States was not broad before Pearl Harbor. And that's not really accurate. Now, it is true that it wasn't until late 1941 that the U.S. public started to view getting involved more favorably and were willing to take actions to help the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, even if they did lead to war with Germany. But you also have to remember that FDR had already been part of the cabinet of a presidential administration that went to war with broad public support, and that support very quickly deteriorated once the war had started, and within a couple of years after the end of the war, many Americans were wondering why we'd ever gotten involved at all. That, of course, was World War I. FDR really was looking for that one event that was going to both completely solidify American public opinion so that it didn't drop away before the war could be completed, but would also get Congress, which was still hesitant, regardless of broad American public support for going to war. The 1930s and 40s weren't that much different from today. While the American government in the 1930s and 40s was probably more responsive to the desires of its citizenry broadly than it had been, or indeed has been since at any time in its history, politicians still listened a lot to opinion leaders in the media, on Wall Street, and industrialists. And opinion leaders, for the most part, were strongly opposed to getting involved in Europe. Congress itself had actually enacted fairly stringent guidelines against what the Roosevelt administration could do to assist the British in their war effort. Congress was more responsive to the thoughts of opinion leaders and industrialists, Wall Street financiers, and other folks than it was to actual American public opinion, and there were Democrats and Republicans who were very hesitant to get involved. FDR was looking for that one trigger that would justify American involvement and also solidify American public opinion. And so Pearl Harbor was that trigger, but it wasn't the only reason that America wanted to get involved in the war. And FDR's search for that one trigger, that one event, has spun its own genre of narratives and speculation about Pearl Harbor and what happened that could be its own video, so I'm not going to get into that right now. However, in the outset, I did promise a semi-realistic scenario under which the terms and conditions I had mentioned before could have occurred. And to look at that, you have to go to Operation Torch, which was the United States invasion of North Africa. It was the very first major military operation for the United States in the European/African theater during World War II. And Operation Torch is, again, part of a lot of narratives that have come out over time that say that it was essentially a pointless venture, as they usually lump the invasion of Italy in there as being pointless ventures that just ended up getting a lot of men killed, and they were of no value, and the only reason we did them was because the British wanted us to close off North Africa so that they could reopen the Mediterranean for their own selfish goals. This is present all over the political spectrum. There's a lot of criticism from all over the political spectrum regarding this. Oliver Stone's documentary series that details a lot of what he feels happened in the 20th century actually makes a point of this. And so it's not just the right that this is coming from or any one particular faction. But getting back to the topic of the actual invasion in North Africa, when we got there, we learned an awful lot about the deficiencies in our own forces, in terms of both the combat doctrines and also the equipment that our guys were carrying into battle. And granted, our equipment that we had, a lot of it was issued with planned obsolescence in mind. The M3 Lee tank was a weapon system that was never intended to be a long-term fix. It was a stopgap solution that we employed while the Ordnance Division learned how to build a tank. I mean, you think about that, and that seems weird, but we literally had to learn how to build a tank. We had to learn how to be able to mount that type of firepower into a turret system and how to build a turret large enough, how to build it sturdy enough. All of that stuff had to be learned. It had to be designed from the bottom up. And we weren't really ready to do that until after the war was already underway. The initial prototype for the Sherman wasn't designed until very late in 1941. It didn't go into production until early 1942. And so we just didn't have them in sufficient numbers. And so the M3 Lee was what we had. And it was like that a lot during Operation Torch. The guys went in with what we had. We didn't have a lot of the new stuff, and so there was a lot of finicking around with how to deploy this stuff, how to deploy our soldiers around different new weapon systems, and just figuring out what worked and what didn't. And North Africa was a really good proving ground and sandbox for that sort of thing. And so if you watch the movie Patton, you get the impression that Kasserine Pass was this horrendous defeat for the United States forces. And it really wasn't. It was more of a minor setback. And in general, we achieved all of our strategic objectives through these battles in North Africa. However, the generals then realized that those victories in those smaller battles, if they were blown up to a larger scale, were coming with losses that would be seen as unacceptable to the United States public and political leadership. And so they worked a lot of those kinks out, and it wasn't the great General Patton coming in and kicking butt and instilling discipline and shooting at bomber planes with his pistol that got the United States military functioning properly. It was a full team effort by everybody who was involved to look at what was working and what wasn't working. And then when we get to Italy, another operation that a lot of people say was a total waste of time, you look at the landing at Anzio, and we learned an awful lot there about how to conduct landing operations and about the level of preparation and deception that would have to go into a proper landing. And it's unfortunate that a lot of people had to die to figure that out. But if we had made the same mistakes at Normandy, my God, the casualties would have been completely unacceptable again to the United States public, and you would have had tens and thousands of people dying. Italy also taught us how to fight over rough terrain. I mean, that's something that we had to learn. We had to learn how to deploy our forces over rough terrain. And that's something that came in handy later in Europe, in the northern European areas, where, a lot of people picture that as just being flat ground, and certainly a lot of it is, but it's not entirely. There's certainly a lot of rough and broken terrain, especially around the Ardennes, especially near the Rhine. And by fighting through Italy, we learned how to deploy larger forces in rough terrain and actually fight as tactical units in that type of environment. And then that gets us to Operation Sledgehammer. It's funny to think now, with everything that I've laid out up until this point, that early in the war, when we're talking about who wanted to play it cautiously, who wanted the narrow front, who wanted the broad front, who was considering the logistical concerns of warfare, and who was more interested in just rolling the dice, the roles were actually reversed amongst the Western Allies. And so initially, the United States military wanted to go straight to France in 1942. And it's something that they kind of played around with called Operation Sledgehammer, where the United States military just wanted to take the forces that it had, both the ones that actually had training, but also the newly raised Green divisions that didn't really have any combat experience whatsoever, and they certainly hadn't had any of the doctrinal experience or the experience of the equipment at that time. And they just wanted to throw that directly into France, land at either Brest or at Calais or someplace like that, open up a front, roll the dice, see what happens. And the British, as I'd mentioned before, were able to talk the Americans out of that idea. It was actually Marshall and Eisenhower who had initially expressed interest in this straight to France idea. And Churchill and the British were able to talk them out of it. They were able to talk them into Operation Torch in the North Africa campaign instead. I think that had the United States military gone forward with that type of strategy, best case scenario, the early losses would have been so horrendously appalling that even American public opinion may have turned against the war and turned towards a negotiated peace, or at the very least forced the American political leadership to abandon the Germany first strategy and go after Japan, who of course had actually attacked the United States. Again, this is sort of creating a scenario that is somewhat plausible where you could have had this type of situation occur, where you had a negotiated peace with Germany amongst the Western Allies. I don't think that this is realistic, just for the simple fact that after Sledgehammer was abandoned, the United States then came up with Operation Roundup, which was a far better thought out plan for the invasion of Europe and was supposed to take place in 1943. And once Eisenhower and Marshall and the planners back at home, both in the industrial and in the military sector, and the Supreme headquarters for the Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, once they all got together and started looking at this, they realized that the logistical concerns of an invasion of Europe were so immense that it was worth taking the time to just sit back and make sure they got it right than to try to open up a second front. And so, as I said, even this early invasion scenario is probably a little unrealistic, because the United States generals, once they got down to actually thinking about it, realized the wisdom of this long build-up into Operation Overlord in 1944, and they realized the wisdom of making sure that they had overwhelming, absolutely, without a doubt, superior firepower against the Germans right away rather than throwing a bunch of inexperienced green units without proper equipment into the meat grinder and just seeing what happens. And so people always want to talk about the Sturmgewehr or the Panther or the Stug or the MG42 or the Stuka. And they always want to talk about these really cool Nazi weapons that were out there. But if you're interested in the question of which fighting force in the war actually had the most effective equipment, it's the Western Allies, hands down. They had more jeeps and more radios and more anti-tank guns, trucks and 50 cals and artillery, and they had far better combat doctrines for deploying all of these things than any other fighting force, by comparison, in the war. But it took a long time to build up all of that. It took a long time to produce all of the stuff and ship it over and figure all that out. So if you launch the earlier attack in 1942 or 1933, you lose a lot of those advantages. And so if you want to answer the often asked question of what was the most important weapon of the Second World War, the most important weapon of the Second World War was the Liberty ship, because it facilitated the production of thousands and thousands of these things, facilitated the buildup of the United States Army. It allowed our guys to have all the fuel, all the weapons, all the supplies that they needed. And so to wrap this all up, people who tend to write histories, they love the big guy. They love the great leader. They love the grand tactical move that finishes things off. They love that expertise as they see it, as is often represented by idiosyncratic figures who stand out from the pack. But if you really understand why things happened the way they did, then what it really came down to was a stable political leadership, stable political and military leadership that was risk adverse, that understood the needs of fighting a resource war, and had been placed there by a populace who were willing to make their own sacrifices toward the goal of building a logistical and military capacity that was so overwhelming that there was no way that the Axis powers and the Nazis could have defeated it realistically. That's the video. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe if you did. Thank you very much.